Fabulous novel approaches in kidney cancer. I'm going to do the first half. Brian's going to do the second half. You're going to keep me on time, Brian. Okay, I'm Tom Poles.
John Hemmack. Christian Commonsberger with 2 N's.
David McDermott.
We shortened your name, Christian. I'm Brian Rini. All right.
Okay, so the first trial, which I thought really surprised me, was lenvatinib and everolimus versus cabozantinib in refractory renal cancer. I have basically been pretty rude throughout my whole life about the combination of lenvatinib and everolimus. I didn't like the randomized phase 2 trial against everolimus by itself. It was underpowered with only 50 patients in each arm, and actually it never achieved overall survival and didn't, in my opinion, clearly beat lenvatinib alone. So when it got FDA and EMA approved and was widely used, my immediate reaction was, this is probably over-treatment with a combination. The combination therapies haven't done spectacularly well of targets in kidney cancer, and the Len-Eve didn't do particularly well in the CLEAR trial from a survival perspective. So I've always been pretty anti it. So guess what? Cabozantinib, which is the drug which I thought was fabulous and great single-agent therapy, and my go-to drug, which I thought was going to be very hard to beat, has looked like, well, it has been beaten significantly from a PFS perspective in this 85-patient randomized phase 2 study in pre-treated individuals. It showed better overall response rate. Yes, the toxicity was probably a little bit higher, but at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that it's manageable, and cabozantinib is not the easiest drug in the world to give. And so I look at this and say, this has changed my mind. Has it changed your mind, Brian?
I thought the data were interesting. I thought a few things. Yeah, I was surprised at the result. I think we have to remember that the fitness level of people who can make it to MD Anderson and get on a trial, and John can comment, I think is different even than the fitness level of people who make it to our academic centers. When you look at the toxicity, the VEGF-mediated toxicities like proteinuria and hypertension are higher in the Len-Ev, and it just got me wondering whether Len is maybe even a little better or certainly more VEGF-targeted TKI. I hadn't really thought that before, and they've not been compared, and I don't know that these data tell us, but at least from a hypothesis standpoint, I think it is more toxic. If you look at that bottom bullet point about, 70% more grade 3 tox and more discontinuation. So tox tables only tell you so much, but having given a lot of both of these, it's definitely more toxic.
David?
So I think they should be given some credit for doing head-to-head trials. I think it's always worth trying to figure out what drug is best in class. That said, I agree with Brian, the tox doesn't allow me to want to switch. I don't use a lot of Len-Ev, mainly because of the EV. I don't think it adds much at all. So this would not change my practice, but we should encourage more trials like this, and we should make them multi-center and bigger, is what I would say.
Let's keep going if we can, because this is a slide which you made, Brian, and this study overall looks like the combinations, and from left to right, you can see the results of different combinations in this disease. Cabozantinib is the control arm of CONTACT-3, performing with 41% response rates. Do you want to talk your way through the other combinations there and what you thought when you were making the slide?
I don't know what I thought when I was making this slide, but basically the first two columns are what I thought at the time was VEGF monotherapy reference standard, HIF monotherapy reference standard from the recent large trials. You can see the data there. Then I inserted the Len-Cabo that we just saw in the previous slide in tabular form. And then the final two columns are VEGF-HIF combinations, and we're going to talk about that more in the next slide or two. So Lenva-Belzu, which is the investigational arm from 011 that we now know is positive. This is from the 03B, a separate randomized phase 2, was reported within the last year. And then the Cas-Cabo, very early signal, small number of patients. Many of us in the room are doing that study. So this is Arcus's HIF inhibitor plus cabozantinib. So it was kind of single agent and then moving towards VEGF-HIF combinations, which is sort of where the field is going. And again, you could see differences in response rate. I don't think there's huge differences, putting aside the single agent belzutifan. Minimal response rates, complete response rates. And I think that's important. When I'm treating a refractory patient, I'm thinking, number one, about toxicity, because I don't think we're curing anybody in the refractory setting. So I think that's important. And then the other data you see.
Where do we go next, Christian, with this?
Or I think what that data shows that combinations with HIF-alpha inhibitors are potentially interesting. We have the press release for the 011 study that Len-Bel is better in terms of the primary endpoint DFS than cabozantinib. I think we need to see that data, what that difference really looks like. In my personal experience, lenvatinib is a very active TKI. I've never seen data comparing it with another TKI directly. So the question is, where does the benefit mostly come from? But depending on the outcome of that study, that could potentially change the landscape.
So this is lenvatinib with belzutifan
Correct.
versus cabozantinib in pre-treated patients who have had immune therapy and VEGF TKI therapy. Christian, what does positivity look like for you? What's practice changing positivity in this study?
Or just clinically, I think the minimum I would have to see is a good benefit in terms of progression-free survival.
Give me a number, hazard ratio.
Hazard ratio 0.6.
Oof. Dave McDermott.
I was going to say 0.7. I think the curves will separate a little late based on what we've seen with belzutifan in the past. 0.7 would be enough. I'd want to see a trend in OS, at least something. That's going to be harder to show.
I think I agree with David on the numbers. I think if there's not OS, then we're going to be discussing and debating, obviously the value of combo versus sequence balanced against toxicity, et cetera. Although I don't imagine Belzu added much toxicity, but I think that'll be the conversation.
And cost as well.
I was quite. I'm not.
Not that we care about cost.
Well, no, I care.
Sorry to bring that. I apologize for bringing that up.
I'm from the UK. We don't get drugs if they're expensive. Unfortunately, I think that actually changed, but that's a discussion for a different day. Let me have another way of. I listened to the prostate session earlier on. Yeah, which I enjoyed, incidentally. There was this long discussion about quality of life that doesn't normally happen in our circles. Really, we don't talk about quality of life very much in kidney cancer.
We talk about it. You might not pay attention to those talks. In fact, I think you just gave a quality. Didn't you give recent quality of life?
I did.
That's why nobody paid attention.
It was like
It was an empty room. They said
belzutifan Tony, right? He's like first author.
Is the quality of life.
Right.
Okay.
Jeez.
We don't talk. That's why we don't talk about it. Why is no one here? You haven't mentioned quality of life particularly in this situation. Is this a situation where the doublet with quality of life? We've never really said. We always say, oh, no difference of quality of life. Maybe here, maybe there.
I mean, I think as we've talked about before, the instruments to measure quality of life, I think, are poor in this setting. But there's no question that 2 drugs are more toxic than 1. I think we'll agree. And so that's what I said. Depending on the magnitude of benefit and survival or not, if there's not survival, then we are going to have that conversation. It might be quality of life metrics. It might be toxicity. It's all dancing around the same thing. Like, is it worth it for that PFS gain, whatever it turns out to be?
But if you're looking for quality of life, and Tony mentioned this earlier, Niraj's 013 study, single agent HIF, probably more active if you bring it up earlier. If we really want to find the cleanest drug, to me, it's a HIF inhibitor early with a marker that predicts for benefit. I want to hope we as a field, for once, could come up with a tumor-specific marker for outcome. I think we can. I want to believe we can.
What is the marker?
We don't know yet, but there is some hint that markers exist, and some of those data are being presented at meetings. For example, whether it's GLUT1 expression, for example, could it be HIF2 expression? There's a number of different groups that are looking at this. We should look at it in a robust way in all of these trials. So for example, if a patient doesn't respond to IO, a select group should go to HIF, in my opinion, and they can be on that drug for years.
Brian, talk me through this study. Peak 1 is a trial which is looking at casdatifan, so it's cabo plus or minus casdatifan. I'm guessing that we would all expect that to be positive if lenvatinib and
I mean, this is really just a construct slide to say we saw the first signal from 011. There are other studies that are either ongoing or planned / like Peak 1 and others that aren't public yet that are going to be in this IO VEGF refractory space, that there's going to be some sort of VEGF and some sort of HIF. And then the conversation, I think that's what this poll is around, is what's the most appropriate, what's the most proper control arm, right? Is it still single agent TKI? Does single agent belzutifan cut it, right? I think single agent TKI would beat single agent belzutifan in this setting. Or is it len belzu? And obviously we haven't seen the data. And I think probably these poll results reflect that we haven't seen Len-Belzu data, so maybe for some people they said, well, single agent TKI, at least until I can see that.
This study, I think, is Keymaker 03 is, I think, Chris, I think you were involved in this study and recruited dozens and dozens of patients in my recollection. When you look at this trial, and it's a multi-arm trial, it's a frontline study, and it's, I think it's, I am a great fan of this trial. It's a big study, it recruited lots of patients. It helped inform the randomized phase 3 trials from a response perspective, and one could look at and potentially adjust statistical analysis plans and other bits and pieces associated with that. Some people say, well, it's only read out now and the randomized phase 3s are already up and running, so how's it really changed things? I actually think it was helpful, and it had an adaptive type design which allowed different arms to take place at different times, as was the case in Stampede. And it's a big study also. There are 2 or 3 observations here, but Brian, what was your first thoughts about the control arm and what this trial taught us?
I mean, I think in general, Len-Pembro did really well in this trial, right? Which maybe we're not surprised about, but it's hard to beat, and it's going to be hard to beat in a phase 3. The Len-Pembro Belzu, which didn't look better from a response rate, maybe better from a CR standpoint, although again, we're getting into small numbers, but did look better, from a PFS standpoint, which would make sense for belzutifan, right? You wouldn't necessarily expect us to have an early tumor shrinkage effect, but maybe a later effect on disease control as measured by PFS. The LAG-3 was disappointing. I don't want to get you started on LAG-3 because we'll have a whole argument about it.
To it in a minute.
I think what was most...
I just want you to focus, if you may, on the HIF part. We're coming to the LAG-3 and the CTLA-4 in a second.
Oh, well, then I'm done with the HIF part, I think.
Okay. So, David, because Hans isn't with us on the stage, unfortunately, so someone's going to have to support the light blue column, the CTLA-4. What's gone wrong here? And earlier I was critical about the Ipi-Nivo versus Nivo 8x8 trial, which we haven't yet seen. But here we're not seeing spectacular results when you add CTLA-4. What's the story there? Is this another example of, you need to have faith in the long term of CTLA-4, or on the one hand, or is this just more of the emperor's new clothes?
Well, this is not the CTLA-4 you were talking about earlier, so you could argue that the drug is not as good.
Then durvalumab did seem to come home with tremelimumab, so it might not be magic Ipi.
Okay, it's also given differently, so not as much up front. And to me, CTLA-4 adds, we think, to pure IO approaches. We don't have any evidence that it adds much to VEGF-based regimens. I mean, Cosmic 313 is a perfect example of that. So I'm not surprised by this result. I don't think this arm made any sense, to be perfectly honest. And this
It's part of the randomized phase 3.
I understand. And my next sentence was going to be, this suggests that that arm is going to be dead negative.
In the randomized phase 3. Do you think Hans might say, I don't know if you're here, Hans, but
It's like 10 feet away.
do you think Hans might say, Tom, this is immature, this is response, it's an OS drug, and you just need to do a late analysis in that randomized phase 3, and it might come home?
Yeah, all it is true. He might say that, but I don't think he advocates for pure IO regimens. He's an immunotherapist at heart over there. See that? He's giving me the thumbs up.
Okay, so fabulous. I do want to come on to the other arms because it is important to me, because we spend emotional energy, we spend research dollars, we spend our time thinking and our patient resource doing trials. The LAG-3 TIGIT programs in kidney cancer and in bladder cancer have not been successful. The Roche programs have been closed in both drugs. That announcement's been made. Yes, Rela has activity in melanoma, but TIGIT hasn't come home in a big way in lung cancer. The overall story is these 2 targets have been spectacularly underwhelming. And we've seen the same again here, haven't we, Christian? Is it time to close all of the trials involving these 2 agents and moving on to better pastures and actually putting patients on trials that may be positive in the future?
Yeah, I think we need to look for different targets. There's now an increasing volume of evidence that those 2 targets will not pan out in kidney cancer.
Brian.
I think I would echo David here, or channel him and say that I think when you're studying it with TKIs, you're going down the wrong road. And I don't think we've adequately studied them in pure immunotherapy regimens. I'm getting a thumbs up to my right.
Yes, and there are a couple of randomized trials looking at LAG3 that are worth enrolling to answer the question. Because LAG3 expression in the tumor microenvironment has been associated with resistance to PD-1 based on human samples from multiple trials. So
Yes.
that is also work from the Seniority Lab.
But Roche have closed their program, and
Yes,
now MSD have closed their program. They've spent probably hundreds of millions of dollars in kidney cancer and bladder cancer, trying to get these over the line. They didn't design the trials badly on purpose. They were doing the best they could, and so now you're both saying, "Hold on a second, we just need to keep doing it until we do it. Eventually, we'll get a positive trial." Surely there's something better out there.
I don't think either of us said that.
Okay.
What we said was if you're sticking it with a TKI, that might be going down the wrong road, and you need to study pure immunotherapy regimens that also involve LAG3, which was the success story in melanoma.
Okay, so we're going to move on quietly. More thumbs up here from that end. I'm really struggling a little bit today. I haven't got as many allies as I expected. I'm going to pick my stage slightly differently next year. Let's move on to this study, Brian. You're involved in this study, randomized phase 3. We've seen a positive adjuvant trial. We've seen a positive second-line trial. We've seen PFS data that looks promising for the triplet.
Yeah.
Although the primary endpoint was response that was negative, the PFS was great. And if PFS is the primary endpoint of this trial, inevitably this trial is going to be positive, isn't it?
Well, I think seeing the data Christina's presented about the top triplet with Belzu, I think certainly made us more hopeful, right? At least from a PFS
Percent
perspective
chance of being positive. Percent chance of being positive.
of being positive for, and I'll just
PFS.
find for PFS for the Belzu arm.
Yep.
I don't know, 90%.
90%. David?
I'd say 60.
Oh. David?
What?
No, you said you agree with you. I said David. David, you agree with David. It was just a comment.
Yeah, no, I'm an expert at predicting things that won't work.
So we're going to summarize, Brian. You'd be pleased to know we're on time for a change.
We're on time. You're doing a great
Yeah. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize this part of. Then we're going to move on to the new drugs. And,
Sounds good.
And you're going to move to VEGF PD-1 bispecifics. I think that the HIF story has had an incredibly good month. I think many people felt that it could just be a late line therapy as a monotherapy. Many people in the room spend a lot of time trying to move these drugs early in combinations, knowing that combinations in the past haven't been spectacularly successful with different types of VEGF therapy. And I recognize this is a different mechanism of action. And those two positive trials, I think we need to look at the results. But I think kidney cancer has become much more exciting again. And I think we're going to have a good couple of years in kidney cancer working out where the best place to use belzutifan is. And the earlier might be better. Brian.
I agree. Advance to the next slide, and then I'll take the. So we're gonna. One back. We're gonna move on and talk about. There's 3 or 4 different topics on sort of novel therapy in kidney cancer. And we're gonna start with PD-1, PD-L1, VEGF bispecifics. John Haymock from MD Anderson was kind enough to wander his way into a kidney cancer conference as a lung cancer doctor. He's done a lot of work. Yes, round of applause, please. John, we appreciate you coming, and you have a huge amount of expertise in these bispecifics that we just don't. So this, I'm going to ask you about this, and then I put in your 2 slides that you sent me on lung cancer that I'll ask you to comment on next. But this is a mechanism slide from a very famous iScience paper that sort of walks through this binding cooperativity and some of the theoretical advantages that I pulled from the paper. How do you think about this mechanistically? Do you think these advantages are real, et cetera?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks for the invitation. And actually, before I get to that, I'll just say it's reassuring for me living in the lung cancer world to see the same debates getting played out over and over in different spaces. And I think only the probabilities change. I think our Len-Pembro probability was probably 70% for a study that ended up being negative ultimately from the LEAP studies. But anyway, yeah, so, we have experimented with PD-L1 and PD-1 and VEGF combinations for a long time in lung cancer. And mechanistically, it's always made sense. We know VEGF is immunosuppressive. In fact, a long time ago, and Brian and I interacted back in the VEGF space, when we look at the best biomarkers of VEGF inhibitor resistance, they end up being largely immune markers, myeloid markers and others. So the dual targeting mechanistically has always been appealing because of VEGF's immunosuppressive effects on myeloid-derived suppressor cells, T cells, and so forth. So with that said, when we've combined PD-1 and VEGF in lung cancer, the results have been, there's been a little bit of benefit. And so when I was asked early on with these studies with the bispecifics, they said, well, this isn't just going to be Bev and Atezo together. It's got this cooperative mechanism. I will say I was skeptical, so I did not expect this to be much of a difference maker. So when I saw how the Harmony studies were powered, I'll be honest, I thought they were wildly optimistic to start with. Just to give a order of magnitude and why I'd say that, probably the best data we've got is from the Empower 150 in lung. And so, for those not familiar with the lung cancer frontline studies, the standard was Bev chemo, BCP, and then 2 other arms. It had BCP with the Atezo, so the ABCP, and it just had Atezo with chemo without the Bev. And really, there was very little difference between the ABCP and the ACP. Both were a little better than BCP, but it meant that Bev was not making a huge difference there. The hazard ratio there for adding Bev was probably about 0.9. So I did not expect to see PFS hazard ratios better than 0.85 or something like that for these studies.
You want me to go to the?
Yeah, so this was really the
I guess you were wrong.
this is the one that broke the internet, so to speak, or at least in the lung cancer world. And this is why you saw Summit's stock prices go through the roof. So this is taking on first-line pembro, and in lung cancer, we've got pembro monotherapy and Atezo and cemiplimab as well, but pembro is usually what we use, or we've got chemo combinations. We also use CTLA-4, but we use those in smaller groups. And a lot of studies have been done, and very rarely has anything even shown a favorable trend against pembro. So this was head-to-head, randomized phase 3. Now this is China only, so that's one caveat. And it's PD-L1 greater than 1%. In the US, we use it just greater than 50%. We don't use monotherapy in the 1 to 49s. But it's a randomized study, well-designed. And the hazard ratio comes back at 0.5. So this was really stunning of a PD-1 VEGF bispecific, versus pembro. And so this immediately raised the concern that this drug was just going to sweep pembro out of all these different places there as well. Yeah. So then then the price came back to earth here, and this is worth a little bit of explanation. So just bear with me for a moment about this. But this is in the EGFR mutants. When you get to second line, chemotherapy was the standard. We have amivantamab now in combination. And we know EGFR mutants are very VEGF dependent. They actually constitutively upregulate HIF. So we expected this to be a good place. Immunotherapy does almost nothing in this setting. And it started, we would expect a PFS hazard ratio of 0.6 to lead to a straightforward approval, as long as the OS hazard ratio is favorable. But this had an issue with the study, which it had a China component. That was called the Harmony A. And then it enrolled the rest of world asynchronously. It sort of started it after. So the rest of world, the European and US cohorts, so it enrolled asynchronously. So it was mandated to have overall survival as the primary endpoint, which usually wouldn't be the primary endpoint. Normally we would just have PFS. And it ended up just missing on PFS. So the P came out to 0.057. With long-term follow-up, it's 0.03, but with their statistical plan, formally, this is negative. So the FDA has announced that at this point, this is not approved. And, I think this is where we saw sort of a rebound effect. But let me say a PFS hazard ratio of 0.5 in this setting. We knew pembro failed in this setting, Nivo failed in this setting. They both had hazard ratios around 0.9. That's still a very impressive PFS result and a solid OS result that would usually lead to an approval.
So clear activity in lung cancer in a space, at least mechanistically, didn't think where it would work. So there's something to the mechanism here.
Right. And I'll mention, we've seen now a third randomized phase 3, the Harmony 6, again, head-to-head against a PD-1 with chemo, hazard ratio 0.6 there. So it's sort of 3 for 3 in randomized studies, beating the expectations with hazard ratio in that 0.5 to 0.6 range.
John, people tell me that the different things about their interpretation of this do two subsets of the trial and the China cohort. Some people say, well, it's a just a really underpowered trial and it's noise within the study, and inevitably, that these things happen when we do these sorts of trials. And other people say it's a very different population. The results in a Chinese population is likely to be different from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to do these trials all over again and start again in Europe and the United States and do completely different studies. Where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, that was, and it's a great question because I think it depends on the subgroup. And so let me give some context. The Harmony study here is in EGFR mutants. And typically we see EGFR mutants, they're a relatively homogeneous group. If you look at responses to TKI in China and in rest of the world, the response rates look, almost identical. They're superimposable. There are groups that are different though. So I'll give an example, small cell. In China, 20% of small cell are non-smokers. In US, about 5% of small cell are non-smokers. So there's, it's a different population, and VEGF inhibitors seem to work better in China in some of these subgroups. There's some data supporting in EGFR mutants, VEGF inhibitors might look a little better in China, but the results were not very different. What was the case, though, is that when the OS had enough events, it was immature for the North American and European cohorts. And this is the problem with enrolling cohorts asynchronously. And so that meant that it was really unfortunate, I guess, the way these two cohorts ended up enrolling. And I think that was a major, what one imagines a major regulatory issue.
David?
So I probably shouldn't speak, but I'm going to ask John a question. Was part of this data set just updated at SITC yesterday?
Yes, and yeah, that's right. So the long-term follow-up, the Lee, Shining Lee is one of my faculty members who just presented this a couple days ago at ESMO. So that's a reference.
But doesn't it?
Oh, I'm sorry. It should say SITC, not ESMO there. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. So,
My mistake.
But wasn't the update considered positive for OS? Or
Right, so that's the long-term follow-up data.
Right.
But the primary analysis was based on the number of events.
I see.
And the number of events ended up being largely China events because that cohort enrolled before the rest of world cohort. Okay. And so that's why one imagines regulatory agencies have a problem with that because while it's an OS study, the OS doesn't reflect the North American and European cohorts.
I see.
Because they rolled afterwards.
John, people, we've done a lot of work, and we're going to talk about kidney cancer in a second, but coming to a kidney cancer meeting that we spend literally days talking about VEGF TKI IO therapy, literally days. But David, some of your early work with bevacizumab and atezolizumab, some of that work suggested that the bevatezo signature was most prominent in the immunogenic patients, not the VEGF patients. And the question is that is there immunogenic component to VEGF therapy in kidney cancer, which is powerful? And then the other issue is the action of these bispecifics, because people talk about the topography of the two drugs being, the two targets being attached to the same drug may be relevant, which is getting this over the line. People talk about daisy chain effects and attracting immune cells. Is this just VEGF TKI therapy given a different way, or is this an immune boost therapy which is acting very differently from what we'd expect? And David, first you want to talk about your bevatezo data, and then John, if you could then maybe just talk to me about whether you think there is something unusual going on here.
Yep.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, everything John said about what led to these combinations, he obviously led us here. We built on his work and others in this space. And I think early on, we thought we were seeing a pro-immune enhancement from adding Bev to atezo. That was certainly what was seen in the original phase 1. But that was based on small numbers of patients with small numbers of biopsies. We thought we were seeing more immune infiltration, which was essentially one of the proposed mechanisms of action. Now, if we were truly getting that in more patients, we probably would have seen a firm OS. We would have seen a tail on the curve. We would have seen all of the things that you see, more CRs when you're enhancing the immune response to the tumor. In kidney cancer, we didn't see that. We can talk about why we might not have seen that. But we did see it in hepatocellular cancer. I say we, meaning the field saw that, which are significant improvements in overall survival. There are multiple reasons for this. I don't know exactly how this potential combination is working. It makes me a little concerned that OS is not stronger, because that makes me wonder, are we truly enhancing the immune response of the tumor in these patients or not? But I'm eager to see more data and more spaces and more tumor types. And I agree that these drugs are probably much better studied outside of kidney cancer, I think, because at least in kidney cancer, if you're truly blocking the VEGF axis, you're probably creating hypoxia in certain tumors, maybe those angiogenic tumors, and hypoxia inside of a tumor is probably not good for an immune response. That's what I would
John,
say.
last word on mechanistically on this, I think you were going to say.
Just a couple things about the mechanism. So the preclinical data, and we didn't go through it, does support that this daisy chaining, at least in the preclinical models, meaning you're linking together different molecules. And when you add VEGF, you're better at clearing PD-1 off the cell surface. And when PD-1 is present, you're able to soak up more VEGF. And presumably this is reflecting this cooperative binding. And I'd say the in vitro data is reasonable. I'm aware of a lot of other preclinical data that supports that, certainly potential. But this also means it's relevant if you're blocking PD-1 or PD-L1, because the daisy chaining happens in different places. If you're blocking PD-L1, well, that is largely localized in tumor cells and some other areas, so you may really get the concentration effect around tumor cells. PD-1, of course, is going to be largely on T cells and some other immune populations. So, because we don't really understand what the key part of the mechanism is, we've got dozens of drugs, but we're not sure if there's going to be a difference, because this is where a PD-L1 that binds VEGF, like pumitamig, the BNT327, may have a very different effect than a PD-1 VEGF, and it may depend on the state of oligomerization here.
Make PD-L1 great again in kidney cancer, John. John, my last question to you. What advice would you give the kidney cancer community about this drug? Should we use it as a monotherapy, or should we use it in combination with CTLA-4, or should we use it in combination with VEGF-targeted therapy?
Yeah, well, so first of all, from everything we've seen in lung, it really does look better as monotherapy. And again, we've got a big experience of failed trials with TIGIT, failed trials with multiple other drugs. And, this is the first thing that in multiple randomized phase 3s has really shown a delta that you could sort of design a study around that's big enough. So, I think building what you'd normally build around it, I think makes a lot of sense. Now, I would say for lung, it's taken us a long time to identify some subgroups that need CTLA-4 or need other immune subgroups. In our case, we see drugs like mutations like STK11 and KEAP predict these poorly immunogenic tumors with poor antigen presentation. They get a lot of benefit from CTLA-4. It may be those subgroups don't exist for kidney cancer, or they haven't been figured out yet, but it doesn't seem like CTLA-4 for the overall population is really the thing to bank on here. Again, with the caveat.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Yeah, with the caveat that my last kidney cancer patient treated more than 20 years ago. But anyway, so, I think you've got a lot of agents, including HIF2, that make a lot of sense mechanistically. But it looks like for your other immune drugs like LAG-3 and TIGIT and CTLA-4, it may take a little more work to figure out what those groups are that are getting more benefit.
Thank you, John. Thanks again for coming and your expertise. These are data from Zinan Chang, who's actually supposed to be here, had to not make it last minute. This is from ESMO a year ago of the BNT compound in kidney cancer. 2-cohort study, a second-line clear cell, the first line of the characteristics table there, and then a first-line non-clear cell called A and B respectively. And then on the right side is the waterfall and PFS. So I hadn't really seen this data until I was preparing these slides. David, what do you think? I mean, I thought there's activity here.
True, although it looks similar to Pembro in the non-clear cell arm, maybe somewhat better, small numbers.
Okay.
And similar to what you see Nivo second line, response rate-wise. There is activity, so let's do a randomized trial.
Okay. Christian, any different? Are you a little more optimistic?
Well, I think
Maybe not.
based on the data you have here, and the question is, will it be really better than just the single agents or the combinations as regular drugs?
Yes, that is the question for the field. These are the PD-1, PD-L1 bispecifics. We've mentioned a couple of them. A Pfizer compound, ivonescimab that John talked about in lung, BNT, and then some others earlier in development. Just as sort of, they're different. There are clear mechanistic differences here. These are not all the same. without going through all the details. There is a randomized, not randomized, there's a trial in MD Anderson, a 2-cohort trial that you see here that's testing single agent ivonescimab. There are plans with some of these other ones that aren't public yet, but this is the only trial that I'm aware of in kidney cancer that's public, unless you know of others, David.
So what's your control arm for your pivotal trial with this class of drugs?
Well, I think it depends on the setting. Where would you develop it? Why don't we start there? You have pick your favorite drug. You don't have to pick the specific drug. How would you develop it in kidney cancer? And Christian, I'll ask you and Tom the same thing.
If I'm BMS, I go head-to-head frontline against Ipi-Nivo.
Ipi-Nivo versus their bispecific.
Yeah.
Which arm do you want to win? I'm not sure.
I think they win either way.
Okay, what's the end?
Well, Ipi-Nivo is the new sorafenib in frontline. It's easiest to beat, right? Frontline.
I think it's better than sorafenib.
I didn't say it was compare. I'm just saying it's the one that you can beat in the front line.
Okay, so
The bar is the lowest. If you're focused on early endpoints.
against Ipi-Nivo. Christian.
I would be a bit hesitant to put it immediately into first line. I would like to see some more kidney-specific data first, something like what we see
Something
here,
like, yeah.
or post-adjuvant therapy, or in a TKI pretreated population.
Something.
Well, just to be clear, I agree with everything Kristen just said. I thought we were assuming these were active drugs.
Well, I'm just saying,
Right.
You're king of the world. You can develop
Yeah.
these drugs, this drug, a drug, however you want. That's what I was asking. Like,
Right. Whichever looks promising frontline against
but you'd go frontline against Ipi-Nivo. Tom?
I'm not clear that this monotherapy agent would beat Len-Pen first line. In fact, I would
think
pretty
unlikely.
confident it
Yeah.
would not.
Okay. But what would
And
you
so,
do? What would
so
you
if
do?
that's the case, as a monotherapy,
You could do combinations if you want.
you are probably going to struggle a little bit, and therefore its home probably is with CTLA-4, as therefore what would be a form of triplet therapy of Ipi-Nivo versus VEGF PD-1 bispecific plus Nivo. And so it's the doublet versus the triplet. It's a rerun of Cosmic 313, but with this drug, which we think is more
Instead of Cabo.
But why not develop BNC327 versus Len-Pembro?
Well, so John, this is a question for you. We are anxious from a proteinuria perspective and an adverse event profile perspective about combining with VEGF targeted therapy, and our history of doubling down on VEGF targeted therapy hasn't been that successful. But what you're saying to me, and David said to me earlier, is this drug may actually be an immunogenic type drug, and combining those two together is attractive. I think both the questions are worthwhile asking, but I'm probably slightly more concerned about the tox signal with the VEGF TKI. That doesn't mean, if it was me, I would explore both avenues, and one of them might be really, really great. I don't think we know the answer right now, but what I think is that this is not going to end up being a monotherapy in the first line, which means if you want to use it as a monotherapy, it's going to have to be used post Pembro, and then you're going to have much more. In my experience, that's going to be complicated.
Up at least theoretical reason that the combo may work well. Yeah, one thing we've always seen with the TKIs, and this is a host response, not necessarily, it also has a tumor response component, but TKIs reproducibly upregulate a whole host of cytokines, and it's something we've never really understood, but you can even give it to mice without tumors, you get these upregulated. VEGF itself gets upregulated, and so when you give the TKI, that compensatory VEGF upregulation may drive further activity of the bispecific. It may actually increase its localization. And that tumor-specific localization of the VEGF blockade is why it seems to have less VEGF systemic tox than bevacizumab does, despite the fact, the VEGF part of IVO is Bev, so the top of it is Bev, but it seems to have less Bev toxicity. So the TKI here, you may really get a mitigation of that toxicity, at least theoretically.
Interesting. All right, lots to come on this. Stay tuned for next year. All right, one slide on cell therapy. Monty, thank you. He helped me construct this slide. So the first two are CAR T cells, the CDX130. There's now a CDX131. These are data. Money, are you in the room? Where are you? Oh, there you go. So jump in if you need to. You could see, I think it was like the first patient had this dramatic response, not much activity otherwise. I know there's a new construct and a new trial going on. Ritesh sent me the second column there of ALLO-316. There's a CAR T construct presented at ESMO last year. Oh, we got a pinch hitter from the bullpen, Monty, coming in with what I thought was, pretty good activity. And when you're restricted based on CD70, et cetera, although it's subsets, it looks like there's increased activity. And then this bispecific T-cell engager, this XmAb, which is an ENPP3 bispecific. And I think these data were just presented, right, Monty, at the targeted therapy meeting with some activity. So thanks for coming up, Monty. So give us, maybe I'll start with you then. So give us, and you can go pick any one of these you want, the ones you're involved with, and just where do you think we are in developing cell therapy for kidney cancer?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think that the CAR T story on those first two panels there is a bit of a Goldilocks story. CTX130, terrific from a toxicity perspective, very little CRS, easy to manage. That's something I could see, sort of rolling out to, multiple practice sites, but just not enough activity. On the other hand, and Ritesh is in the room too, he and I worked together really closely on this ALLO-316 study. In fact, he's presented several iterations of this data. I got the sense that maybe, it's a little too hot in terms of toxicity. We went through many, many challenges in terms of, sort of developing a strategy around this. And in the end, I would say response rates were modest. And we talk about the complexities and nuances of differentiating tox with a HIF-2 inhibitor versus VEGF TKI. This is like next level. It really requires a lot of hands-on management for hematology, et cetera. On the other hand, I'm actually quite keen on this particular bispecific strategy, XmAb 819. So this targets, what I would consider to be a relatively novel antigen in RCC, ENPP3. It's very, very pervasively expressed in RCC relative to normal adjacent tissue, and RCC is really a standout in that regard. There's also modest expression in papillary RCC of note. This was a clear cell cohort. These bispecific studies, you know this well, Johnny, they just take eons, right, to work through various dose levels and so forth. So we had first patient in on this study 3.5 years ago. Really? Yeah, and so we've worked through 10 dose levels on this trial. We finally got to target dose levels to, think about presenting this data. And we're starting to see a good signal of response. And this is, you can see it in these little green dots down here in very heavily pretreated patients, median of 4 lines of prior therapy, up to 8 prior lines of treatment, and some very deep and sustained responses, which you don't see on this waterfall plot on the right-hand side there. So I think this really has legs. Tox management is tough for the first month of treatment, but after that, it's really smooth sailing. It's very, very different.
Thanks, Monty. David, you're an immune cell therapy kind of guy. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm all for exploring this more in kidney cancer, but unless we change our attitude towards kidney cancer and whether we think it's curable or not, most of these... We, maybe you and I do, but we meaning the entire field. So I guess what I'm getting at is if you have a lymphoma patient and you're a community doc and you don't cure them with R-CHOP, to refer them to a center to get an aggressive treatment. We need to create that kind of mindset more in not just us as GU oncologists, but in our community oncologists who refer us patients. Because as Monty points out, the accrual to these trials is glacial, number one.
So you're saying there's not enough referrals to populate the trials? I think Monty said it was glacial just because of the dose levels.
Well,
right?
there's 2 reasons it's glacial. One is referrals are slow, but 2, the referrals are often late for these trials. Like you need to be thinking about these things after your patient progresses on PD-1. Because anyone who progresses on PD-1 is almost certainly going to die from their cancer, and they need to at least think, do I want to go on life-lengthening therapy, or do I want a chance at cure? That conversation needs to happen much sooner than it does for most of our patients. In my mind, that's not just true.
We don't know that these drugs are curative yet.
No, but they offer you need to have the conversation, and if you do, like they do in lymphoma, for example, you can pursue some of these approaches. If we take the approach that we're just going to do this in late-line patients who've had 3 and 4 therapies, it's going to take forever. Patients are going to do poorly.
So you're advocating
early
more
intervention.
development, but earlier, and you'd be comfortable giving this to a second-line patient. I certainly would in the right context.
Yes, I think BiTEs are particularly attractive for the reasons Monty mentioned. There are now people who are developing CARs that are modified to deliver BiTEs into the tumor microenvironment, believe it or not. So that offers a lot of advantages, and maybe it can be adapted earlier. But if we're going to give our patients 3 and 4 lines of therapy before we consider these things, they're not going anywhere.
I got the point. Christian, anything to add?
No, not really. I think.
Yeah, I'll add, one of the lessons from tarlatamab we've seen, and, it does take a lot to get the doses right and so forth, but, it looks like T-cell exhaustion at baseline is a pretty good predictor, as well as tumor bulk, of who's going to respond and not respond. So, I think as you think about these, if you're really waiting till the immune system is exhausted, till you're on third-line therapy, you've already progressed after PD-1, response rates are really dramatically lower. And it really seems to be a game changer in small cell only when we're moving it into the frontline setting. That's where we're suddenly changing the course of the disease and dramatically changing the OS.
Thank you. Mani, did you?
I think David's message is so spot on. I mean, for everyone sitting here in the room, me and Ritesh pair up on a lot of these studies, as to a handful of others. If we can get these referrals in post, PD-1, that would be tremendous. I bet you this waterfall plot on the right would look a lot different if we were treating second-line patients. When we're treating in the 8th line, it's like, totally anaplastic phenotype. It's totally different.
Right, and I think John's story about tarlatamab in small cell is really important for an additional reason, because anything that becomes established as a standard in lung cancer, everyone needs to learn about, and we need to develop programs to deliver it. So thinking about intensive inpatient programs that can deliver tarlatamab and the next bite and the next one after that are designed by oncologists, so we don't have to give up our patients to our heme malignancy colleagues, God bless them. That'll advance the science, and I think that, so in some ways that small cell approval is really important for this entire space, I think.
All right, we're running out of time. We're talking about microbiome. Monty, these are your data from 2 separate trials looking at Ipi-Nivo plus minus CBM or Cabo-Nivo plus minus CBM, very small but randomized trials, but seeming to show some advantages which are represented on the screen. And I just wanted to show this SWOG study that I think Pedro is leading if he's in the room. Monty, you want to just talk about this and where it stands?
Yeah, I have to give a ton of credit to Nasli, who's here in the audience, that really drove those smaller studies that were published in Nature Medicine. I will say the signal's compelling, but super, super small numbers. Having said that, I think we've all been in rooms where we've had less data than that to guide a phase 3 trial design. So I think that this is very rational and it's a very logical next step. So good luck to Pedro in leading this.
And it's happened. This trial's happening.
Yeah, Q2 of next year is when we anticipate opening. We have a drop dead date, so for FDA, so we're gonna do it by then.
Okay, so good to see microbiome stuff moving forward, promising, but small early signals. But congrats, for doing the definitive randomized trial. So, and then, so Kim 1, we're out of time. Kim 1, this is a slide that Vincent Hsu made. He couldn't be here, but he made this slide. He's done a lot of the work, and this is just sort of describing Kim 1, which you've alluded to it several times throughout the conference as a biomarker. This is data in various settings, both pre-diagnostic, adjuvant, and metastatic disease. And I just wanted to show this. I thought it was an interesting alliance. I believe it's an alliance trial, right? I don't know if it's proposed or happening, but basically looking at, and David, can you speak to this? Were you involved?
I was not involved. Brad was here. He can speak.
Yes, this is based on Vincent's work, both with 214 and Cosmic 313, showing that a 30% decline in KIM1 at day 22 identifies the exceptional responders to Nivo-Ipi. So given that the design is such that patients with clear cell RCC would have a baseline KIM1, start Nivo-Ipi. If they have that exceptional decline, they would continue on standard Nivo-Ipi. If they don't have that exceptional decline, we'd be looking to randomized between Nivo-Ipi or trying to IO TKI with Zanza with Nivo. So really trying to use this dynamic biomarker.
Thanks. And the primary endpoint is PFS between the top 2 arms. I mean, you predict that the TKI arm would win.
Who would think? ASO. Got it. And we'll just point out that the decline in KIM1, that 0.7 ratio, is unique to immunotherapy alone. So Vincent looked at this in the 313 Cabo arm. Everyone's KIM1 declined. It was not associated with predictive response. And then if you look at the Javelin Renal as well, the early decline in KIM1 with a TKI there is not such a long-term response. So this is really unique to IO alone.
Thank you. All right, we're going to close. This is the last slide. This is just data we presented from Optic. I know Katie's in the room looking at depth of response to Cabo-Nivo in this angiogenically selected cohort. On the bottom left, there's different angiogenic signatures out there, right? And Tony's published in Javelin, and we've done in Keynote and Optic, and they're surprisingly not overlapping, not overlapping a lot. So I guess we'll end with this is do we think we're at, how long until we're at a point where we have an enrichment biomarker to select patients, David? Could be this, could be something else. It's just an example.
Well, at the rate we're doing it, it's going to be a while, but we're learning a lot that we could put to use to speed that up. So I think one of the most important things to learn from the Optic trial is that we should be doing our gene analyses from metastatic disease and probably large samples. So we should move more towards a lung cancer model where we're biopsying our patients at progression, getting bigger pieces like we do in lymphoma. If we do, we'll get probably more consistent data, better data. We also have better tools. And that's the other thing that came out of this presentation that I think is really important is you can do this work, and I think the technology is going to exist that we're going to be getting RNA signatures on our patients. We might as well try to learn how to use them. I think the future is bright if we learn from our past inadequacies, I would say.
John, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just a word of caution, and I agree this is, I think, an important direction for VEGF biomarkers. They're not going to be simple. We've been looking for simple ones for a long time, but I just want to say it's important to do this from randomized studies, because what we've seen in lung is that the markers that seem to predict greater relative benefit from VEGF are negative prognostic markers. So if you look in a single-arm study, it may not look like a group that's doing better, but compared to a control arm, that's where you may get a better hazard ratio. So in lung, at least, worse tumors get more relative benefit from VEGF. So you need to randomize control arm.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true in RCC. Kristen, do you want to comment? How far do you think we are away from a biomarker-selected approach in kidney cancer?
Quite a while if you want to have a real biomarker-driven trial. But I'm actually encouraged of what we've seen over the last 2-3 years, what's coming down the pipeline. I think for the first time, we have something where we can at least start to create trials that may not be optimally, but may give us some positive signal.
Monty, are you?
I have to say, Brian, if you produce a similar waterfall plot to this and clusters, is it 4 and 5? Or
4 and 5 are the ipi-nivo, yeah.
Right. If you produce a waterfall plot like this, I'd like to at least have this readout on a Tempest test, right? I'd like to have that at my disposal. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm not going to guide decision-making entirely on it, but it's one of those practice-informing measures.
We would like that as well. All right, I think that's our last slide. Thank you all.